I thought I had all the time in the world to make things right. After all, I was just 60 and still strong enough to work on my boat every morning. But when the doctor told me I had a failing heart, I realized time was no longer on my side. My daughter, Lily, hadn't called me Dad in 30 years. The last time I saw her, she was 3 years old and clinging to her mother's leg. I had hoped one day she'd know the truth, that I didn't walk away. I was pushed out. Last spring, she sent me a message. For the first time in decades, my phone lit up with her name. "Come to Emma's birthday party," she wrote. My hands shook. Was this it? The moment I'd been praying for? I imagined us hugging, her daughter calling me Grandpa. Maybe even a photo together, for the mantle I'd kept empty all these years. But when I arrived, she smiled politely and turned to her friends. "This is my biological dad," she said. The words hit harder than any storm I'd sailed through. That night, I opened an old box in my attic and found the letters I'd sent her. Returned, unopened, stacked like tombstones of a relationship that never stood a chance. And in the corner, a single photograph of us together. A birthday I don't even remember attending. Something was very wrong, and for the first time, I wasn't just fighting for her love. I was fighting for the truth. The gulls cried above the harbor as Michael Hayes stepped off his small boat, the wooden planks creaking under his weight. 58 wasn't old by most standards, but the sea and solitude had carved lines into his face far deeper than his age suggested. His home, a weathered one-story cottage on the edge of a small coastal town, was both sanctuary and prison. In that silence, there were no arguments, no slammed doors, no memories he didn't want. But there was also no Lily. It had been 35 years since the divorce, a courtroom session that lasted less than an hour. She had been 3, with hair like spun gold and eyes wide with confusion. Michael had gone in believing the truth mattered, that the judge would see he was a good father. But the law favored stability, and stability meant her mother's home. He had walked out with an empty wallet, an emptier apartment, and a custody agreement that might as well have been a restraining order. The years that followed blurred into a pattern. Long days fixing engines at the shipyard, evenings nursing a beer alone, weekends staring at a phone that never rang. Sometimes he'd see children on the pier and wonder if Lily laughed like that, or if she'd grown tall like her mother. He had tried. God, he had tried to be present. Letters at Christmas, birthday gifts, little notes with sketches of boats he thought she might like. But there were no replies, no thank yous, just silence. One gray afternoon, Michael decided to clear out the old shed behind his cottage. Dust coated everything. Rusty tools, coils of rope, boxes he hadn't opened in decades. At the bottom of one, wrapped in yellowed paper, was a stack of photographs. He flipped through them absent-mindedly until one stopped him cold. In the photo, he was sitting beside Lily at a birthday table, a cake in front of them with pink frosting. She was smiling, missing a front tooth, leaning into him as if they belonged together. But Michael had no memory of that day. None. He stared at his own face, searching for recognition, and felt a strange chill. He could recall every precious second he'd spent with her. How could this be missing? Was it possible someone had taken her to him without his knowing? Or had the moment been so brief, so emotionally jarring, that he'd locked it away without realizing? The next morning, as he brought coffee to his porch, Michael thought about all the times he had mailed gifts and never heard back. A creeping suspicion took hold. Later that week, while buying supplies at the hardware store, he ran into Paul, an old friend from before the divorce. They hadn't spoken in years, but the conversation turned naturally to family. When Michael mentioned Lily, Paul's face changed. "I don't know if I should say this," Paul began, glancing around. "Back when you two split, I worked part-time at the post office. I saw her mom there more than once. She'd pick up packages addressed to Lily, then toss them straight into the bin before even leaving the building." Michael's stomach twisted. "You're sure?" Paul nodded. "I didn't want to get involved back then, but yeah, I saw it with my own eyes. Some of them were still sealed. Letters, too." Michael felt a surge of heat rush to his face. Not the anger of a moment, but the slow burn of 35 years collapsing into a single, devastating truth. He hadn't been ignored. He had been erased. Every attempt to reach out had been intercepted. Every memory stolen before it could exist. That night, he sat alone at his kitchen table, the photograph lying between his hands. He traced the image of Lily's smile with a finger, wondering how many moments like this one had been taken from him. For the first time, the narrative he'd carried of being unwanted, forgotten, shifted. It wasn't that Lily had turned away. She had never even been given the chance to know him. Outside, the tide receded, leaving the harbor quiet and empty. In Michael's mind, the silence was no longer the absence of her voice. It was the deliberate act of someone who had chosen to keep it that way. And deep down, he knew that if he ever wanted to reclaim even a fragment of what was lost, he would have to dig up the truth. No matter how much it hurt to hear it. The cardiologist's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and stale coffee. Michael sat on the edge of the exam table, listening to the rustle of papers as Dr. Klein flipped through his chart. The man's expression was calm, but Michael knew that kind of calm. It was the sort that preceded bad news. "Your heart isn't working the way it should," Dr. Klein said. "You've got significant damage. We can manage it with medication. But I'd be lying if I told you we could turn back the clock. You need to think seriously about what matters most in the time you have." Michael heard the rest: diet, exercise, follow-up appointments. But those words about time kept echoing. What mattered most? For 35 years, it had been the same answer: Lily. And suddenly, the urgency of that truth was heavier than the diagnosis itself. That night, he sat in his dimly lit kitchen, staring at the photograph he'd found in the shed. He thought about Paul's confession at the hardware store, about all the stolen moments. If his heart was already on borrowed time, there was no excuse left to wait. She had to know the truth. He began drafting a letter, but halfway through, his phone buzzed on the table. The screen lit up with a name he hadn't seen in decades: Lily. For a second, he thought his mind was playing tricks on him. His hands trembled as he opened the message. "Come to Emma's birthday party this Saturday, 3 p.m. Emma, his granddaughter. The granddaughter he'd never met. His pulse quickened, not from the heart condition, but from a rush of hope so strong it made him dizzy. This was it. The door he thought was welded shut had been cracked open. For the next 2 days, Michael barely slept. He imagined walking into the party, seeing her smile soften, hearing her introduce him as Dad. Maybe she would finally ask why he'd stayed away. He would tell her everything: the letters, the gifts, the truth, and maybe, just maybe, she'd believe him. On Saturday, he shaved carefully, put on the best shirt he owned, and stopped at the bakery for a cake. His heart thudded in his chest as he pulled up to the modest house in the suburbs. Children's laughter spilled out into the yard, balloons bobbing in the breeze. He rehearsed a dozen greetings in his head. Lily was by the grill, turning burgers. She looked older, of course, 40 now. But there was no mistaking the tilt of her chin, the eyes that were his. She saw him, waved, and walked over. "Michael," she said, smiling briefly before turning to the small group gathered nearby. "Everyone, this is my biological dad." The words landed like a fist to his ribs. Biological dad. Not dad. Not even my father. Just a cold clinical label, as though he were a fact on a birth certificate. He forced a smile, shook a few hands. No one asked him anything. No one even seemed to know why he was there. The rest of the afternoon passed in a blur. He watched Emma open presents, blow out candles, run laughing through the sprinkler with her friends. She didn't know who he was. Not really. He tried to catch Lily's eye a few times, but she was always busy, always turning away. As the sun began to set, Michael carried the empty cake box to his truck. He told himself, at least he'd been there. At least Emma had seen his face. But the hollow feeling in his chest was worse than before. He'd imagined a reunion. What he'd gotten was a transaction. A courtesy invite to fill a gap in the guest list. Later that evening, his phone buzzed again. A message from Lily. "I just wanted Emma to know what you look like. Nothing more." Michael stared at the words until they blurred. His hands felt heavy, his breath uneven. It wasn't rejection in the abstract anymore. It was deliberate, precise, and final. She wasn't ready to hear him. She wasn't ready to believe him. And if his time truly was running out, he'd have to decide how to spend the little he had, waiting for her to come around, or forcing the truth into the open, whether she wanted it or not. The message from Lily stayed on Michael's phone like a wound that wouldn't close. He read it again the next morning, hoping the words would change, but they didn't. Outside, the tide rolled in under a low sky, gray and heavy. He tried to distract himself by clearing out the attic, a chore he'd avoided for years. Under a stack of mildewed blankets, he found a battered cardboard box, its corners taped and retaped. His name wasn't on it, but the handwriting on the address labels was unmistakable. His own. He pulled off the top, the smell of old paper hitting him instantly. Inside were letters, dozens of them, all addressed to Lily, some in envelopes with neat blue ink, others scrawled on brown packaging paper. Every single one was unopened. There were gifts, too. Small boxes wrapped in faded birthday paper, still creased where the ribbons had once been. A snow globe of the lighthouse in their town. A child's life vest in bright yellow. A book of illustrated fairy tales with a note inside. For Lily, from Dad. The ink was slightly smudged, as if his hand had trembled when he wrote it. His pulse quickened when he noticed the postmarks. One after another, the stamps revealed the same truth. These packages had been mailed from this very town, and not from years ago when he first moved here after the divorce, but from dates as recent as 15 years back. He sat down hard on the attic floor. 15 years. That meant that for nearly half her life, Lily had lived close enough for him to run into her at the grocery store, to see her on the street. Close enough for a conversation that never happened. The weight of it pressed into his chest. How many times had he thought she was in another city, another state? All the while, she'd been right here, and he'd been feeding the narrative that she didn't want him. Later that week, Michael decided he needed more than dusty evidence. He needed someone who had seen what happened. Someone who could confirm what Paul had told him at the hardware store. There was only one person who came to mind, Mrs. Tully, the neighbor who'd lived next door to Lily's mother for decades. He found her in her small front garden, trimming rose bushes with steady hands. She was in her 70s now, but her eyes were sharp as ever. "Mrs. Tully," he greeted softly, not wanting to startle her. "It's been a long time." She looked up, recognition flashing across her face. "Michael Hayes." "Well, I'll be damned. I was wondering if you'd ever come knocking." They talked for a few minutes about the weather, the town, the people who'd come and gone. Then Michael took a deep breath. "I need to ask you something. Back when Lily was little, did you ever notice anything about the mail I sent?" Her hand stilled over the roses. She glanced toward her house, then back at him. "You really don't know, do you?" Michael's stomach tightened. "Know what?" "It wasn't her mother doing most of it," she said quietly. "It was him. That man she married after you. I saw him a dozen times at the mailbox, rifling through the deliveries before bringing anything inside. If there was something from you, he'd rip it up or toss it in the trash bin right there. Sometimes he'd even brag about it to the fellas at the bar, how he was protecting his family from a deadbeat." Michael swallowed hard. "Protecting? From me?" Mrs. Tully gave a short, bitter laugh. "He didn't want you back in her life. Didn't want Lily to remember you. Said if she ever got close to you again, you'd take her away from them. So he made sure she never had the chance." The air seemed to thin around him. It wasn't just neglect or even passive cruelty. It was an active campaign to erase him. Every unopened envelope in that attic had been a victory for a man who had worn his absence like a trophy. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Michael asked, his voice low. "I thought you knew," she admitted. And honestly, people were afraid of him. He had a way of making trouble for anyone who crossed him, even her mother. She kept her head down. I'm not saying she was innocent, but she wasn't the mastermind either. Michael stood there for a long time after she went back to her roses. The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the steady hush of the sea. He felt something shift inside him, not the tentative hope he'd carried to Emma's birthday, but something harder, sharper. If this was the truth, then the years he'd lost weren't just stolen, they'd been taken by force. And if his heart was running out of time, he wasn't going to spend the rest of it quietly disappearing. The idea had been growing in Michael's mind since the day he left Mrs. Tully's garden. Confronting Lily directly had failed. Waiting for her to discover the truth on her own was a gamble he couldn't afford. His heart condition was a ticking clock, and the seconds were sliding away. One morning, while reading the local paper at the diner, a headline caught his eye. "Parental alienation, a hidden epidemic." The article was written by a young reporter named Claire Morrison. Her picture was beside the piece, bright-eyed, determined, the kind of face that looked like it had no interest in letting injustice slide. The story detailed cases where one parent had deliberately cut the other out of a child's life, sometimes with devastating long-term effects. Michael folded the paper under his arm and drove straight to the newspaper office. The receptionist seemed surprised when he asked for Claire, but within minutes she appeared, notepad in hand. "I read your article," Michael said without preamble. "I think you should hear my story." They sat in a corner booth at the same diner where he'd found her work. Michael laid out the evidence, the unopened letters, the birthday gifts, the photograph he didn't remember taking. The neighbor's testimony. Claire's pen scratched furiously across the page as he spoke, her expression shifting from curiosity to outrage. "This is textbook alienation," she said when he finished. "If we can back this up with proof, it could make a powerful case. Not just for you, but for others in the same situation." "I'm not interested in headlines for the sake of headlines," Michael replied. "I want my daughter to know the truth. I want her to see it with her own eyes." Over the next week, Claire helped him compile everything. They photographed the attic box, cataloged every envelope and postmark. She interviewed Paul and Mrs. Tully, recording their accounts. By the end, the file was thick enough to fill a binder. When the segment was approved for broadcast, Michael felt a strange mix of relief and dread. The truth was coming, but so was the fallout. 2 nights before the scheduled air date, there was a knock at his door. He opened it to find Lily's mother standing there. She looked older, smaller somehow, her hands twisting the strap of her purse. "Michael," she began, her voice shaky. "I heard about the story." He braced himself for accusations, but instead she said, "Please, don't do this." He frowned. "Don't tell me you're still protecting him." Tears welled in her eyes. "It's not about him. It's about Lily. She doesn't know what he's like. And I wasn't as strong as I should have been. He threatened me, Michael, more than once. If I let your letters through, he said he'd make sure I lost her too. I thought I was keeping her safe. Maybe I was wrong, but I was scared." The confession hit him like a wave, anger at her silence, sorrow for her fear, and an unexpected flicker of sympathy. She had been trapped too, though her choices had cost him years he could never get back. "Why tell me this now?" he asked. "Because if you go through with it, she'll hate me," she whispered. "She might never forgive either of us. Please, I'm begging you. Find another way." After she left, Michael sat at his kitchen table, staring at the binder of evidence. Protecting her image meant sacrificing the chance to give Lily the unvarnished truth. But sparing her also meant allowing the man who had stolen decades from him to remain unexposed. The day before the broadcast, Claire called to confirm the final edit. "Your choice, Michael. We can name everyone involved, or we can keep certain details private. But once it airs, there's no going back." He thought of Lily, of Emma, of the empty mantle in his living room. Then he thought of the man who had thrown his letters into the trash, laughing. "Leave her name out of it," he said finally. "But make sure his is front and center." Claire didn't hesitate. Understood. We'll focus on him. When he hung up, Michael felt the first clear sense of purpose he'd had in years. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming the truth, and doing it in a way that might still leave the door open for the daughter who didn't yet want to walk through it. The segment aired on a Thursday evening. Michael sat alone in his living room, the television casting a pale glow over the walls. Claire's voice was calm but firm as she narrated the story. His story. The screen filled with images of the unopened letters, the gifts, the postmarks, revealing just how close Lily had been all those years. Paul and Mrs. Tully appeared on camera, their voices steady as they recounted what they had seen. Claire never mentioned Lily's mother by name, just referred to her as a parent who may have been under pressure. But when the footage shifted to the man who had married her, the man who had intercepted the mail, there was no anonymity. His name, his photograph, even a clip of him from a recent town event appeared alongside the words, "accused of parental alienation." The phone started ringing before the segment was over. Michael didn't answer. He just sat there, listening to the reporter explain how parental alienation leaves scars that can last a lifetime. By Friday morning, the story had spread beyond their small coastal community. On social media, locals shared the broadcast, adding their own comments about the man they had known for years. By noon, Michael learned through a neighbor that the man had been fired from his job at a local construction firm. By nightfall, word was he had packed up and left town entirely. It should have felt like victory. Instead, Michael felt the weight of what came next pressing in. He didn't have to wait long. On Saturday afternoon, Lily showed up at his doorstep. She wasn't smiling. "You didn't have to do it that way," she said, her voice tight. "You embarrassed my whole family." Michael stepped aside, gesturing for her to come in, but she stayed planted on the porch. "Lily, you saw the letters. You know I'm telling the truth." "I saw what you wanted people to see," she shot back. "You painted him as a monster and my mom as a victim. Do you think that makes it easier for me to suddenly find out my life has been one big lie?" He wanted to tell her that he'd done it because he didn't have time to wait for her to come around, that every day was a gamble with his heart. But he knew that right now, anything he said would sound like an excuse. "I just wanted you to know I never left you," he said quietly. Her eyes softened for a fraction of a second, but she turned away. "You've made it impossible for me to be around you without feeling like the whole town is watching. I can't do this." She walked back to her car without another word. Michael stood there, the door half open, watching her drive away. The truth was out, but it had come at a cost he hadn't fully calculated. That night, as he sat in the dim light of his kitchen, an envelope slid through the mail slot. No return address. He opened it cautiously, pulling out a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but careful. "When Lily was 15, she wrote you a letter. She never mailed it. I found it years later and couldn't keep it. I'm sending you a copy because you should know what it said." Below the note was a photocopy of a lined notebook page. His breath caught as he began to read. "Dear Dad, I don't know if you even want to hear from me, but I think about you a lot. Mom says you left because you didn't care, but I'm not sure I believe her anymore. I wish I knew the truth. I wish I could ask you myself. Sometimes I wonder if you remember my birthday. I'm turning 15 tomorrow." Michael read the letter 3 times before setting it down. She had reached out once, all those years ago, and her words had been stolen just like his. The anonymous sender had given him no name, no way to reply. But in that moment, he realized something important. No matter what Lily believed now, there had been a time she had doubted the lies. And maybe, if he could just find the right way, that doubt could be the thread that would pull her back to him. In the days following the broadcast, Michael's world shifted in ways he hadn't anticipated. Strangers stopped him in the grocery store to say they admired his courage. Old friends he hadn't spoken to in years called to offer support. Some even shared their own stories of being kept from a child. The weight he'd carried for decades seemed lighter in public, yet heavier in private. Because Lily was still silent. She hadn't called since the confrontation on his porch. Weeks passed. Every time his phone buzzed, his heart leapt before disappointment settled back in. He tried to tell himself she needed time, that the shock had to settle before anything could grow from it. But late at night, Alone in his small cottage, the doubt returned. Maybe the damage was permanent. Maybe the truth had come too late. One chilly morning, a knock rattled the door. Michael shuffled to answer it, expecting a neighbor. Instead, Lily stood there. Her hair was pulled back, her eyes shadowed, but she was holding something, an old, yellowed envelope. "This was mine," she said, her voice low. "I wrote it when I was 15. Michael's breath caught. She placed it in his hand. The paper was worn, the flap still sealed. His own name was written across the front in neat, careful script. "I found it in one of Mom's boxes," she continued. "I guess she never mailed it." He wanted to tear it open right there, but something in her expression stopped him. She was watching him closely, like the act itself might tip the balance between them. So he nodded and slipped it gently onto the table beside them. "Thank you," he said quietly. They stood in the doorway for a long moment. Michael thought she might turn and leave again, but instead, she let out a long breath. "I'm not saying I understand everything," she said. "I'm not even saying I forgive you. But I don't want Emma to grow up with the same blanks I did, so I'm asking, would you come to dinner? At my house. Tomorrow night." Michael's heart thudded in his chest. "Yes, I'd like that very much." "I'm not promising anything," she added quickly. "I just want to try." "That's all I could ask for," he said. The next evening, he drove to her house, with his hands gripping the wheel tighter than they needed to. The street was lit with warm, yellow porch lights. Through the front window, he could see Emma setting plates on the table, her small hands moving with care. Lily opened the door. She didn't hug him, but she didn't step back either. Inside, the air smelled of roasted chicken and herbs. They sat at the table, just the three of them. For a while, no one spoke. The clink of silverware was the only sound. But Michael noticed something subtle. Lily wasn't looking past him anymore. She was looking at him. Halfway through the meal, Emma asked him about the lighthouse snow globe that Claire had shown on television. He told her it had been meant for her mother many years ago. Lily didn't interrupt. She just listened, her fork still in her hand. When the plates were cleared, they lingered. The silence felt different now. Not sharp with tension, but fragile, as if something new might grow in it if they were careful enough. Michael glanced at the envelope she had given him that morning. It sat on the sideboard, untouched, a reminder of what had been stolen and what was still possible. They didn't solve anything that night. No tears, no grand reconciliations. But as they sat there, the distance between them seemed to shrink. Not erased, not forgotten, but bridged, if only slightly, by the willingness to be in the same room. For Michael, it was enough. The road ahead was long, and his heart might not let him walk all of it. But for the first time in decades, he wasn't walking alone.